Cool. So thank you for joining us for the SBHR Creative Approaches to Public Health Research Seminar Series. Today we're joined by Dr. Stan Papoulia, and they're a research fellow and theme lead for patient and public involvement research at the NIHR Applied Research Collaboration, ARC, South London. They're also a programme lead for online resources for non-researchers and capacity building, also with ARC South London. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Stan open up their PowerPoint and get going. There you go, Stan.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's going to be a little bit of an awkward transition. Whoops. Is that... Can you see the screen now? Yeah,
that's all good. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so hi everybody. So I'm Stan, and this paper is, just as Chloe was talking about creative approaches, I was just thinking how to pitch this, because some of you I know I work in other ARCs from, seeing people coming in, and it's possible that you have seen this, you've heard of this before. I gave a version of this paper in December in a sort of cross-ARC collaboration seminar that where we work on PPI research. So there's going to be some different emphasis, but also I'm going to present some of the cartoon work that is associated with this project, speaking of creative approaches, and then we can have a discussion about that, hopefully, because that is work in process. So this the presentation today is part of the findings of some of the findings from the work on the labor of PPI, and particularly looking at how people who are in the sort of so-called PPI or PPIE workforce are part of this labor or are embedded in this kind of labor, and what that tells us for what examining that labor tells us for the possibilities for transforming research systems so that they become more inclusive. So I just want to start that really this work concentrates on the NIHR, but as I see here, it's also hosted in a sort of NIHR funded organization. So that's kind of interesting. And I became fascinated. Well, I started working in the ARC South London, what was then the Clark South London, its predecessor, is that 5-year grant in 2015. And I became fascinated with how the NIHR, the National Institute for Health and Care Research, works and how it embeds a certain kind of culture of performance management in the doing of health research in the UK. And I became fascinated with, where it came from, how that sort of organization of research started, how it relates to its predecessors, how it works now, and particularly interested because of all funders in the UK. The NIHR was, I think, the first main funder, large funder of health research that put a really big weight on patient public involvement right from its beginning. So when it was founded in 2006, the founding document hailing the emergence of the NIHR, which is Best Research for Best Health, produced this, I think many of you will know this, kind of target type graphic, which really showed that, patient-centered health research is what the NIHR is there to produce. There's a centralizing the system of R&D, of research and development of the NHS, and really focusing it on the interest of patient benefit. And that patient benefit was then expressed through its championing PPI, and particularly through the kind of embedding of Involve, this advisory group that had been independent but funded from the Department of Health since 1996, first called Consumers in NHS Research and then became Involve. And this kind of advisory body that kind of championed a more kind of participatory approach to health research and the importance of including lived experience in the doing and the design and the governance of health research, which then became known in this country as PPI, Patient Public Involvement. So this idea of the NIHR as an organization that says that it is dedicated to PPI from the very beginning. And this has become, if anything, far more emphasized after 2006. So, for example, post the emergence of COVID pandemic, the next chapter of Best Research for Best Health comes out in 2021. And it really puts even more emphasis not only on the importance of working with patients and the public, but in particular of inclusive research, a diverse and inclusive research environment, as a way of combating the growth and the sharpening of health inequality, something that became quite obvious in during the emergence of the pandemic, of the COVID pandemic. And so with that kind of emphasis, we've got a kind of an upping of the stakes, if you like, of PPI. So we've got this idea of community engagement, no longer individuals around a table, but of sustained outreach work with minoritized communities and with so-called underserved communities in research. A huge emphasis on co-production, so much so that often we find that where in research organization websites you used to find PPI, you now find co-production, equity, diversity, inclusion. More recently, this has become inclusive research. And the latest term embraced by the NIHR is public partnerships. Now, I have quite a lot to say about what it means to shift that terminology, but I'm not going to go into now. I'm just going to sort of point at this extract from the next chapter of Best Research for Best Health, where the emphasis is, as I said, on diverse and inclusive research environment, but also there is a recognition that in order to embed such an environment, the NIHR needs to work differently. What that means: outreach, research closer to people, building relationships of trust. It's not very clear how that's going to happen, but I mean, there are a number of toolkits and guidelines that are sort of emerging around that. And since November 2024, we now see that research inclusion, which is the term that has taken over from EDI, is a key condition for NIHR funding. And it's mandatory, it's a new requirement that all applicants demonstrate how their research will address existing inequalities in health and social care. So, and any of you who, like myself, have been involved in new bids through the NIHR, we are now currently bidding for ARC2, may be familiar with all the kinds of work that has been involved in trying to embed inclusion. And so in what follows, I will talk about this a bit. So since 2006 in the NIHR, there's been a sort of a burgeoning infrastructure for PPI, and quite a bit has been written about this in terms of guidelines, standards, in terms of frameworks, in terms of support mechanisms, and so on. But what we found back in 2019, 2020, when we're planning this work, is that surprisingly little had been written about the workforce that had been tasked with delivering PPI. In other words, the sort of PPI leads, PPI coordinators, officers, managers, they're different terms. Very little had been written about them. There's slightly more now, but that was a very odd missing piece, because it just felt that how can you really begin to understand the challenges or the usual barriers, facilitators of embedding PPI if you really are not talking about the labor involved in undertaking it. So and often when we think about PPI, and in many papers published about attitudes of researchers around it, or how service users, those with lived experience, patients and the public, negotiate PPI roles, there's usually this idea that there is a divided rationale in embedding PPI, and that on the one hand, there is this kind of managerialist rationale, which is that PPI is there to simply serve the interests of researchers, clinicians, and managers, to reduce research waste and to improve services. And the other one is a sort of democratizing rationale, that PPI is about democratizing research, serving the interests of patient groups, and perhaps transforming services. So it's a more emancipatory role. And those two kind of rationales seem to be in tension. And in a quite a rare, I think, paper from 2013, two researchers, David Evans and Catherine Pollard, talked about those two rationales, but in terms of the labor of PPI. And so they said that one of the difficulties that people don't often talk about is that there is a challenge or a tension for researchers trying to embed PPI, because on the one hand, they need to attend to their the targets and their sort of performance indicators, which are, publications, quality of research, delivering in timelines and so on, which are very, very tight, and increasing workloads. But on the other hand, we now also have to do something that a series of activities that are there to give service users a voice, to develop relationships of trust and so on. And those two things, being efficient, producing research to target, and building relationships and creating the conditions for empowerment, they don't always work in the same way, and often they clash. And it's interesting that this was one of the, I think, earliest papers, and one of the few papers still, that really kind of dug into the challenges and the things that are usually less spoken about. And at the time, in a phrase that still makes me giggle, they talked about how there is a best case scenario where it's not only us researchers who have to do this, but there is an administrator who can be funded by the grant to take care of what they call the practicalities. And the practicalities are what made me giggle, because that little word kind of was doing a lot of work there. What are the practicalities of PPI? So it's really, the research really started on trying to open up what is meant by these practicalities. As I said, there hadn't been much written about the PPI workforce, but one of the key texts was there was some sustained attempt to engage with this labor and this workforce, was the study, a realist evaluation of PPI research with patient public involvement, which came out in 2015, funded by the NIHR. It identified 6 actions required for effective PPI building, including a key individual, whole research team having kind of embraced an ethic of PPI, and a sustained effort to build relationships. And in that study, they referred to PPI coordinators as boundary spanners, who were meant to bridge lay and research worlds through building relationships, through facilitating, through networking, through negotiating. This is a visual representation of that bridging from rapport. And this is a sort of how we try to sort of have that kind of vision, build that vision of the bridge builder. Here is one of the characters in the comic I spoke of before, Anne straddling the two worlds between, in this case, universities and local organizations. It's a very idyllic image in some ways, bridge building, spanning two different spaces and facilitating collaboration. In rapport, there was reference to the limitations of this and the sort of the difficulties, some of which for that role, some of which were to do with the research timelines, as Pollard and Evans had also said, and the short contracts, including the short contracts of both researchers, junior researchers, who at the time would have been, were most likely to be given PPI responsibilities, but also the short contracts of the PPI workforce itself. So in 2019, the NIHR made a clear presentation of and made of the PPI lead role, and made it mandatory that PPI leads should be costed in and budgeted for any piece of funded research. And they defined the PPI lead as a named member of the team with relevant skills, experience, and authority to be accountable to, I can't really see all of the spelling there, to represent, manage, and embed patient public involvement. Can I ask a question? If I'm, oh, don't know what happened there. If I move something, do you see anything moving here?
Yeah, I saw that move, yeah.
No, sorry, your faces, not the, you don't see your faces, do you?
No, we don't know.
Okay, all right, because I do, so I wasn't really quite sure what exactly you're saying. So, yeah, so, and the web page from 2019, it's recently changed, I'll talk about this in a minute, on the NIHR about the PPI lead, listed an extensive and complex roster of responsibilities. You see some of them, about half of them here, ranging from recruiting, supporting, training public contributors, to developing PPI plans, managing negotiations between public contributors and researchers, advising researchers on best practice in PPI, ensuring PPI contributors receive timely feedback, monitoring, reporting on, and evaluating PPI, and developing and embedding PPI strategy. This list of responsibilities aimed to transform PPI into another deliverable. It aimed, in other words, to give it shape and to make it understandable through the metrics and through the types of performance management that constitute the labor of research, specifically in the NIHR, but also more broadly. Now, so there are actually a significant number of responsibilities. And interestingly, something that sort of struck me and is part of the findings of the project, which I'll talk about in a minute, is that in job descriptions, those responsibilities were enumerated. This is job descriptions for PPI staff. And in some cases, as in the case here, there was a very specific responsibility to ensure that public contributors or patients in the public have a meaningful and rewarding involvement in the work of the institution. So what does it mean to have someone responsible, not simply for liaising with, for negotiating with, for paying, for looking after and supporting, but for ensuring that they have meaningful and rewarding involvement? In other words, for delivering a kind of experience, a positive experience of the relationship between the members of the public and the organization. What kind of responsibility is this? And how does it play out in the day-to-day of people's work? So to start this, one of the reasons we started working on this is because for myself, I guess, I had become a PPI lead, although a researcher PPI lead, since 2015, between 2015 and 2019. And so I had a mixed role, part research, part embedding PPI. And I started to see that a lot of the issues and a lot of the discussions of the challenges were not really rising to the surface. Those were things that we weren't able to talk about outside the kind of the doors of our own colleagues, or not the doors, the spaces where our own colleagues would go. And we really wanted to understand the nature of this work and also why it remains unspoken. And what really fascinated me in particular is how institutional infrastructures, how reporting procedures, you know, the whole ritual of annual reporting, of delivering on SMART objectives and so on, how do they contribute, how do they shape this work? And of course, what are the support mechanisms and capacity building necessary to optimize this work and strengthen PPI in research? So initially, and on a pre-pandemic kind of moment, we were going to do ethnography. We were going to have interviews with PPI leads, so the population where we decided to concentrate not just on the NIHR, but in particular on what were then called NIHR infrastructure grants. And at the time, there were 72 of those. So These were usually grants of 5-year duration, which really built upon, were aimed to create networks of regional collaborations, to create sustainable infrastructure for the embedding and optimizing of research into clinical practice. So we thought, well, these are the grants that are really about embedding collaboration. Let us see what the labor of PPI collaboration is in them. So sampling was purposive, convenient, snowball, and it had the study had participatory elements. So initially, as I said, we started with interviews, then moved to phase 2. We were going to do ethnography, case studies of participatory ethnography of the PPI labor, but we ended up actually doing remote ethnography because of the lockdowns, and also used audio diaries as a particular remote ethnography methodology. And here are just the some snapshots of the infrastructure grants at the moment of funding, 2021. The landscape has changed considerably since. Now, the findings of the first phase where we generated 5 themes, and I'm going to talk about these and what follows. So to start with the first theme, which is the ambiguity of the support role. So the PPI workforce is kind of meant to be set up within particular kind of gradations of, seniority. So you would have a lead manager who increasingly would be thinking about how to optimize PPI, how to plan PPI as a set of deliverables. Then you would have the sort of face-to-face frontline coordinator officer who would work with people and do outreach and have sort of skills perhaps in community engagement. And if you were lucky, you would also have an administrator who would be working on payments and so on. But in reality, although people did have titles such as manager, lead, signifying seniority, coordinator officer, signifying sort of more junior roles. In reality, what people actually ended up doing is far more a kind of a hodgepodge. I don't mean that in a negative way, but certainly a mixture of all these duties. Often people were working in a team of 1, and often people talked about isolation. And what was curious here is that in some cases, people with a title manager would end up not having a team, certainly not a team in a straightforward way to manage. And so one of the participants said that, my title is manager, but I don't have any management responsibility. It's really about managing my workload. So what kind of struck me there is that they were using terms from signifying employment relationships to relate to something that was outside employment relationships. So they talked about, well, maybe I manage myself, or maybe I manage the volunteers, the public contributors. So now, strictly speaking, you cannot manage public contributors because they are neither employees nor are they participants in studies. And so for participants in studies, as we know, there are regulations around sort of ethics forms and so on, the kind of order the kinds of relationships that are possible or not possible with study participants, the right to withdraw, informed consent, and so on. So this is a management of a kind. Of course, with employees, management is very much part of what the employee-employer relationship is. But when you're talking about public contributors, you're not actually managing. You can say that metaphorically, and of course, a lot of public contributors take issue with that for good reason. But in reality, you can't actually manage. So what does it mean to use this term from another realm, a professional realm, to name a relationship that is not professional in the same way? So this was an interesting finding, which actually becomes a refrain throughout, a refrain for all the findings. So like a thread that circulates. And just briefly to say also as part of the same theme that these kinds of support roles were sort of, it wasn't kind of easy to locate. There was a confusion about what support actually means, just as there was a confusion about what managing might mean here. So in some cases, in most cases, support was meant to be assisting the team to deliver PPI. Remember, in rapport, a key part of PPI is that the whole team has to have responsibility for PPI. But in reality, a lot of that support ended up being about the PPI worker, lead, coordinator, or whatever, taking responsibility for doing the PPI. So support means supporting the team by themselves, the PPI person doing the PPI. Then the second theme, the excess invisibility of PPI work. So there was this kind of expectation that PPI could be, in a sense, proceduralized and delivered in the same way as other deliverables, delivering research studies, delivering papers, presentations, and so on. So building and sustaining relationships was understood in the kind of the same way and through the same vocabulary as building research deliverables. So people talked about this kind of magic database. People talked about producing rabbits out of hats and having last-minute expectations of researchers to bring together a group of people to look at their work. So another part of the cartoon here is about trying to visualize what for researchers means to have PPI as a deliverable, as a little bunny that comes out of a hat, and how all of that kind of expectation is set up for 3 days. I mean, this is a slight exaggeration, as cartoons always do, 3 days before the end of the deadline for a research bid to go in. So when we were building this with a cartoonist, Camille Aubry, in November, December, I was thinking, well, this is a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, maybe it's kind of stretching reality a little bit, you know, the expectation that you can deliver PPI in 3 days. About 2 weeks later, we were presented with a version of the bid for ARC2, and we're told, can you take it around to some people from the public research group and, you know, give us some revisions by Monday? So I was like, oh, okay, well, it's not an exaggeration, actually. It is happening as we are making the cartoon itself. Sorry about that. Another way of that kind of expectations about PPI as a deliverable presented itself is this idea that a PPI lead is costed in a grant in a way academic leads are costed. So if someone is called a lead, they're expected to have, for example, typically, and this changed this year, I'll talk about this in a minute, but up to 2023, 21, 23, typically 5, at a very generous allocation, 10% of their time set up for leadership duties. This is an academic lead who is managing a set of work in a professional manner. Sorry about that. And in some cases, the 10% becomes, most cases becomes 5%, in some cases becomes, as here, 2%. And this participant says that I was expected to work out for about 39 hours a year. And for researcher popping the statistician down and academic leads on that bit, they said, well, everyone is 2%, you have to take 2% as well. So what does it mean then to provide categories to make PPI valuable and visible that are totally unfit for the kind of work that PPI is, i.e. 10% at best, 5% most likely, or even at some points, 2% of full-time equivalent. So the third theme is about this kind of PPI as a moral obligation. And this is very interesting that a lot of people talked about overworking, working beyond their hours, right? But the reasons they gave for that working beyond their hours were that, you know, if you want to be inclusive, if you want to really bring people from underserved communities, from minoritized communities, you have to put in the work. So people felt morally compelled to do that because they were delivering a public good. They were delivering a form of social justice. That is how people rationalized it. And often, especially when it came to outreach, there's a sort of a consensus that if you want to reach people where they are, you have to work after hours, you have to work on weekends, you have to work on holidays. So in order to become part of an inclusive research environment or demonstrate how that works, your own labor conditions have to go out of the window. Any distinction between work and not work disappears here in the service of that inclusivity. Yeah, reducing, that says the participants, our job is to reduce the barriers to involvement. And some of those barriers are hours. 9 to 5 is a barrier for some people, indeed. But what does it mean for you to then work your hours and after hours as well? Here again, thinking back to this job description, expectation for experience, delivering experience in positive experience of public contributors with the organization. Some of the participants talked about their commitment to deliver a better experience. Here, a sort of personalized communication, a sense that they had to involve people, even when the time was very little, even when there were all these other challenges and difficulties, because that was what gave them the positive experience. So this idea of having to be the person undertaking that experience, being the person who represents the goodwill of the organization towards the public contributors, that was very much shaping the work that people did and giving them a kind of compulsion to continue to do that work and to continue to work harder. And the other interesting thing is that often that work was not received, or not perceived rather, as work. So people said, well, no, I don't feel that I am pushed to do more work because nobody's telling me to do more work. In fact, a lot of the time in the teams people were working, their line managers, for example, were not people who had necessarily a familiarity with PPI. So they did not understand about out of hours work. So it wasn't that the line manager was there sitting and saying, you know, you must do out of hours work, but it was something that was experienced internally as an internal moral obligation. And for some, this was not even perceived as work because, again, it was something about delivering towards a public good. So it's interesting to me how all these processes of inclusion mean that people who are doing this work, the PPI workforce, are less likely to perceive themselves as, for example, being exploited because they're doing it as they perceive for a good cause. And here is the kind of the key difficulty of saying no. A sense is that if I say no, then I'm harming people and I'm harming research. So it's as though here the responsibility for better research, for a research as public good, kind of pulls onto the PPI workforce. It's as though that responsibility is almost kind of drained from the institution onto the body of the PPI worker. They experience that responsibility. I can't say no, I have to do it. Again, not because the line manager says so, but because it's a moral internalized obligation. And here again, you have this pooling responsibility towards the public contributors, towards a public good, but with no control, with little authority to do something with that responsibility. So often people said, well, I don't feel I'm a member of staff. And here I'm talking about people who are not primarily researchers, are not employed on researcher contracts. They're employed on what we call at King's professional services contracts or research delivery contracts or research adjacent, right? So these are not academics, although some are trained as academics. Their roles are sort of adjacent to research and academia. So they don't feel part of the team. They don't feel they're a full member of staff because they cannot shape the research project, and yet they're expected to shape the PPI that somehow fits on a research project that's shaped somewhere else. And again, here you see this pooling of responsibility, that the researcher can say, yes, thank you so much for your suggestions, your advice, bye now, may never come back, may never produce feedback. The responsibility, again, pools onto the PPI worker who feels it, because they have to then engage and justify that with the public contributors. So people talked about getting caught in the middle. Also, and again, this is something that we experienced in December and November writing the new bid, what you advise or what you put down in the PPI section is not what you then see when the PPI section goes to the funder after it's been edited. So you don't have control over the shape of the PPI activities or plans. Some of that control is kind of located somewhere else in the institution, perhaps in the central bid writing team, who will then rephrase this. But then increasingly, you have to deliver on something that has been edited, perhaps in a very different way from what you had originally intended to write. As PPI lead, says our participant, we are still usually the ones that get the blame. And this is the final theme, which is that, hang on, let me just find the bit here. Sorry, oops. Which is really about a kind of a paradox that people talked about, and that has to do again with the reporting instruments and institutional expectations for delivery. Many of the participants, the PPI workers, recognize that if you want to collaborate effectively between research institutions and publics, you need to redistribute power, right? Remember again, best research for best health 2021, NIHR needs to work differently, okay? But here's the problem, that PPI workers cannot themselves do that. They cannot redistribute power, but they are bound by an expectation to deliver on objectives that can often only be met provided power is redistributed. So you can't do that, but you're still expected to deliver. And if you include PPI, as increasingly is the case, as was the case in the last bid, in the current bid, as a deliverable and as a series of smart objectives, in a competitive research system, the pressure isn't on to report that PPI has been delivered, right, according to the objectives. That the strategy outlined in the bid or put together during the early months of the grant's running, or the setup of the center or institute, has borne fruit, that it was a good strategy. So people talked about they don't have the authority to make changes in the organization, but they are expected to deliver. They are expected to bridge that gap between aspiration and reality, the aspirational bid and what is said in the annual reports. Furthermore, it is increasingly difficult to talk about this. Again, it becomes unspoken. A frequently voiced concern was that while PPI is being progressively under-resourced because more expectations are getting higher and higher, annual reports, which are the mechanism through which PPI is evidenced and evaluated, make it very difficult to be open about such under-resourcing. And this is a quote, we will say things like, we punch above our weight, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. We can't say, you're underfunding us. And also, another participant said, we have to present the good stuff. We can't say, you know, here's all the problems that happened. And again, it's interesting because I did a presentation and included this quote to senior figures in the NIHR back in 2023 with some recommendations. And there was this unease whether this quote here, we punch above our weight, could be included, whether it was okay to show this. Everybody knows that this happens, but it was not perhaps tactful for some people possibly to actually spell this out. which is fascinating and also quite, I'm sure for all of you listening, quite well known. And this final kind of quote, it made it, it's not a final quote, I've just put it at the end, but it kind of makes it dramatically visible, the kind of tension, the difficult space in which the PPI workforce finds itself. People are there to deliver PPI, but they're not there to change the institution. And yet, PPI, in the sense that is expected, can only be delivered if the institution is changed. How do you then get on with it? What is it that you get on with? Because you're not really the person to talk about the things that need to change structurally in the institution, structural inequalities. And as we move now to a greater demand for research inclusion within PPI, this this tension, this difficulty becomes all the more sharper. And here's another part of this that refers really to the increasing mountain of expectations of what a PPI lead would do, and the expectation that they would do this within a considerably limited timeline. Now, a way forward. There have been various attempts, I think in the last 3 years at least, possibly more, to find a way to make this, the labor of PPI, more visible, to create more value for PPI workers, and to create a career progression, a clearer career progression. Here is an example. This was published in BMC Research Involvement Engagement 23, and it was really laying out the frameworks for costing and budgeting, not just PPI activities, paying public contributors and so on, but PPI labor, the labor of PPI leads. This is from the Asthma UK Centre for Applied Research in Edinburgh. And they have set up a set of activities of what it is that PPI staff are doing. And as you can see here in the visuals, they're trying to sort of visualize and give substance to the kinds of relationships, networks, and negotiations that have to be ongoing. So this is one way forward, which might produce its own further problems, but we can, if we have time, we can talk about those. Another way forward, which I have been involved in, is to create a competencies framework for PPI staff. So here is an extract from this. The reference is underneath. It's now on the NIHR Learning from Involvement website. This was set up by Papoulia and PPI staff, led by Papoulia and PPI staff in the Oxford NIHR infrastructure region. And it's an attempt to create a visible career pathway for PPI leads. This has been very enthusiastically received, but we're in the process of reworking it. Some of the problems with these attempts, which are important in terms of professionalization and recognition, is that training and visible roles may not address all the problems. And it is in fact important, while highlighting the importance of training, support, and visible roles and authority, to also highlight that there is another quite massive part of the issue here, which is about research structures. And I mentioned before the web page, the NIHR PPI lead web page, which made the allocation of this lead role as mandatory. In November, that text was changed. This is the current text now, which is far more extensive in talking about resources, and includes this little tidbit here. PPI responsibilities are different to other research management responsibilities, can be very time intensive. The allocation for the PPI lead should not be modeled on the time allocation for other research or team lead roles. This comes directly from the research I've just presented. It is a small win, if you like, in recognizing that PPI leads are not like statisticians or academic leads. However, I think there is a bigger problem here, and I hope that I've tried to make that visible, sorry for the term again, through this talk, that the very instruments through which we recognize, we give legitimacy to this role can actually reinforce inequalities, can reinforce invisibilities. Because all these instruments are underpinned by the expectation that PPI becomes a deliverable. And they are underpinned by the performance management expectations of giving an aspirational PPI section to funder, which is then shaped through a series of objectives. In other words, they're underpinned by this moral obligation of a demand that is contradictory. It is a demand to challenge the organization's business as usual, but also without challenging the organization's business as usual. And it has been the argument of this work so far that the PPI lead, manager, coordinator role is the place where that moral obligation and its force and the anxiety it produces is felt the most acutely. It is as though the research organization has outsourced this anxiety to the bodies of the PPI workforce. So how then do we do this? How do we do what best research for best health requires us to do, to work differently, to build relationships of trust over time? How do we find a way to transform business as usual organizational norms, which are exclusionary, instead of simply reporting that somehow magically they have been overcome? How do we not stay with this, the happy bridge spanner, boundary spanner, but instead find ways to engage with the incredibly difficult and anxiety-producing role of trying to span two worlds which remain exclusive? Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Stan. That was a phenomenal talk.
I've taken a bit more time. I'm sorry.
That's okay. There was so much, juicy quotes and things to engage with. So I'm really glad that you did. Hopefully everyone really enjoyed that. I certainly did. We have a bit of time for questions or comments. So you can either write those in the chat, which someone's already done, or raise your hands. Emma, I'm going to go to your question in the chat. So Emma said, really interested in this idea that as a PPI workers, we are sustaining a structurally unequal system by working over and above our remit. Yeah. I'm fairly new to PPI and working within the uni, having spent the last 20 years in the voluntary sector and having a background in social work and mental health, being very shocked about how hierarchical university structures are. I think transparency is key, but also an acknowledgement of these power imbalances and to mirror back to the institutional structure what's going on. But with this comes a risk. So it's kind of a question / comment. Emma, did you have anything else you wanted to add? Sorry, I kind of...
Yeah, no, it's just to thank you. It's been really brilliant for me to hear this, because I've come in, as I said, my kind of background's in social work, mental health, voluntary sector. I've worked within NHS, I've worked within mental health trusts, so I've kind of experienced the NHS hierarchy. I did my master's in social work at Birmingham University, and I work at Birmingham University with Magda. I was just really, because I was really excited to be getting into a university and just thinking, oh gosh, it's like going to be really forward thinking and really, and I just found it incredibly shocking, the hierarchy, but also the pressure which you've talked about here. And just, we know that mostly women are employed in PPI. Yeah. It's mostly a female workforce, and coming, my last job was for an organisation called the Equality Trust, which looked at socioeconomic inequalities, and so it's like, oh gosh, we're all, whilst there's that tension between we want to do a really amazing job and want to do, but also, are we sustaining these these kind of structural inequalities by actually doing that? And how do we kind of strengthen as a workforce, or strengthen as a profession without kind of, I kind of, yeah, feel a little bit icky about the word professionalism, but you know, in order to, without kind of, you know, still being able to have some credibility and still be able to do our jobs. So yeah, so just really interested, really. Sorry, I'm not sure if that was a very coherent question or anything, but it was more about kind of, I suppose, the way forward in terms of, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Emma, and everybody. Just to clarify something, two things. One is that I'm very aware that I may have given the impression that, you know, PPI is a doomed, you know, endeavor. It's not. I mean, there's a lot of good practice that I've experienced, that I've been part of, including actually in the work that of your colleagues, Emma, that you talked about. And the second one is that a lot of people coming to this work come from the voluntary sector and come from also community development and community engagement roles. And so there is part of that moral obligation, is part of that. There's this kind of desire to deliver something resembling social justice. But how do we move from that is, I think first we absolutely need to surface this, and we absolutely need to again and again say, you know, okay, training is important, support is absolutely important, but that's not enough. It's not enough. You can't train inequalities away. You can't train structural hierarchies that you talked about away. You know, you really need to think about system transformation. And there is only going to, PPI or inclusive research can only go so far once you have this competitive research system where you have to always show that you have done better than, you know, that, for example, we are already doing inclusive research. Really? We already do you know what I mean? You can't start with all the sort of trial and error and the difficulties and then start surfacing these things. So, I mean, I know that what I'm saying, it sounds a little bit too facile, but sometimes it can be quite, I don't know, impossible to say these things, you know.
Just to come back on that quickly, as I want to monopolise the space, so apologies, but I just think it's a really important point. So very much about that transparency, that thing about saying, oh, we are inclusive rather than we aim to be inclusive, I think is really important. And I think actually people are quite shocked because it's often there's this Pollyanna type of like, you know, we have to show we're the best, we're brilliant, we're like amazing. And actually that's really, like, I find that really jarring for the work that because we have to be authentic and we have to build those trusting relationships. And part of that is being transparent and true. Anyway, I'll
absolutely.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, I'm just going to move on to another question, Stan, that relates to
sorry, yes.
Talking about. So Katrina has asked, would you mind saying something about your preferences for current terminology around PPIE, EDI, etc., as language is one way to increase inequalities, and I'm not convinced NIHR are as clear in their guidelines of where we currently should be. Thank you.
Gosh,
quite a big one.
Yeah, that's a very big one. I don't know what to say about my preferences. It's easier for me to talk about my suspicions, I guess. And the suspicions are public partnerships, right? The term public partnerships I find really problematic, sorry about the word, but because it squashes together what? Involvement, engagement, participation. Those terms that when involved was first emerged, the first thing they wanted to do is to separate between those things, you know. Participation in research is different from involvement. Engaging communities is different, blah, blah, blah. Public partnerships squash them all together. And as I see it again and again and again, people writing papers, academics writing papers about involvement, end up writing about participation in research, right? And so that makes that distinction more and more difficult to sustain. Also, partnerships make something look much more easy and kind of, I don't know, to achieve than it might be. It gives it this sheen that Emma sort of mentioned, this kind of benign, benevolent sort of everything, you know. And so the other problem is the dropping of the term patient public involvement as opposed to patient public involvement. So the dropping of lived experience in favor of experience of being part of minoritized communities, which of course is absolutely essential, but so is lived experience of particular conditions. So I think that shouldn't drop out. But maybe because I'm a survivor, mental health survivor researcher, I would of course say that. But I think there is something here about experience that's kind of left out.
Yeah.
I can't say much more, I'm sorry.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Stan. I think that's a really important point about, yeah, that you just made there. So thank you. One really quick thing before we end, just a signposting thing. Someone asked you about the really lovely comics that you've got and cartoons that you put on your slides. Are they available elsewhere, or are they still in development?
So they're still in development. Camille Aubry, I can send you the thing so you can see the name. You know Camille, Chloe. So she doesn't have them on her website because they're not finished. But we will finish them by the end of February. And then the idea is to work with them in workshops to continue these conversations. So I absolutely would love to do more work, including with guys who came today, using those cartoons, which will be up actually on ARC South London website by March, we hope.
Great, fantastic. That's really great to hear. So yeah, stay tuned everyone for the amazing comics that will be released imminently. And yeah, just yeah, please join me in another massive thank you to Stan for their talk today. That was really fantastic and a really great way to kick off this seminar series. Next week, we've got another great speaker as well. They're from Durham University, Scarlett Hall, talking about dancing in the unknown, creativity in collaborative public health research. So I hope you all are able to join us next week. But if not, it will again be recorded, as with all of this seminar series will be recorded, and we'll put it up online for you to view after the fact as well. But yes, thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you so much, Stan. Stan, did you have something?
Oh, can I just make a small request? Can you possibly, can we see the chats? I would love to see the questions if that's okay with everyone.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, at some point later. And people can please contact me. I'm delighted to continue this conversation. Thank you so much, guys.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, please do contact Stan. I can send around an email afterwards as well, with the details once we've got the recordings ready. So yeah. Thanks everybody.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye. Thanks a lot.